or good afternoon, depending on what time it is over there. I am truly grateful for the opportunity to speak at the 44th Annual Conference of the African Studies Association of Australia and the Pacific. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. While I wish I could attend in person, I am excited to join you remotely and be part of this wonderful event. My presentation this morning warmly invites us to look beyond divisions and borders. The title is Beyond Cleavages and Geographies, Leveraging Collaboration and Building Bridges Between the Continent of Africa and its Diaspora. I will cover mainly 4 points. In the first point, I share a gentle reflection and memory that connects our views on where we stand, how we feel the world, how we see things, and the geography of African studies. The second point summarizes my main arguments, but I put this in a question format. The third point explores the idea of diaspora a bit deeper. Basically, I look at 2 cases, that of Black Lives Matter, the condition of the black man and woman in the globalized world. In another case, I look at how COVID was experienced by Africans on the continent and abroad to draw some conclusions. And finally, in my final point, I highlight a couple of key takeaways. So let us begin. I recognize that I am fortunate to be among the few Africans able to travel internationally without restrictions. 2 months ago, I traveled to Cabo Verde for the 6th biennial conference of the African Studies Association of Africa. And while on transit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopian Airlines rerouted my flight through Brussels instead of the original route that was supposed to stop in London and Lisbon. Don't laugh. Traveling on Africa can be quite a hassle. From one country, the Congo, to Cabo Verde, you have to get out of the continent and then come back. And how many stops and how many flights? By the way, many of our colleagues could not even make it to Cabo Verde, either for technical flights cancellation reasons, or maybe for visa, transit visa problems. But no, that's not the point. The reason I could not fly through London is that I didn't have a British visa. Remember the Brexit? So this change caused me to lose my luggage, and I had to wear the same clothes for a week, much like a refugee. When my luggage was eventually found, I noticed my belongings had been tampered with. I immediately report this to the police in Lisbon and later on to Ethiopian Airlines. Let me tell you, to this day, I have not heard a single word from Ethiopian Airlines, despite promises of investigation to see what happened. I'm sure this would have happened on a Schengen space. The customer would have been compensated already. I wanted to recall this experience when I looked for the silver lining, if you will, after being denied the Australian visa. Although I felt disappointed about being unfairly treated by Australian consular services, I was also relieved to avoid airport checks, long waits, transfers, and the emotional strain that go with them. I can tell you, I truly understand what it feels like to hold somebody's passport, being suspected, singled out, randomly searched because of your country of origin, your nationality, or your skin color. But for the very instance that concerns us, the immigration officer who rejected my application explained his decisions as follows. I quote, "I note that the applicant provided support documents. However, These factors do not mitigate my concerns regarding the applicant's intentions in Australia. I remain serious. I quote, I note that the applicant provided supporting documents. However, these factors do not mitigate my concerns regarding the applicant's intentions in Australia. I retain serious credibility concerns about the visit proposition outlined in the application and conclude that it has been made to gain entry to Australia for reason other than for business activity. The bias, the prejudices are almost palpable. As someone who has traveled extensively, and I would like to remind you here, I've been serving the African Studies Association of Africa for the past 2-3 years. I'm a Jesuit priest. I am a managing director of a leading research center on the African continent, and I myself like to think and consider myself as a global citizen holding a valid Schengen visa, a US visa, and a Canadian visa valid until 2028. However, a representative of the Australian government not only misunderstood my intention, viewing them skeptically, but also dismissed the credibility of the organization that invited me, the African Studies Association of Australia, and even the credibility of the person who signed my invitation letter, the distinguished Professor André Renzaro, President-elect of AFSAT. I couldn't help but wonder if my visa application would have had a different outcome if a white Australian professor had signed it. I'm just saying. Now let's move to my second point, which, as I said, constitutes the heart of my presentation, and which will follow rather the format of questions. Yes, it sparks some thought-provoking questions that might not have all the answers to, but they are definitely worth exploring. For instance, I wonder why is mobility, or the movement of Africans today, seeking better lives, opportunities, greater dignity elsewhere, is still viewed as a threat rather than an opportunity in our interconnected world. Another question, who gets to decide about this movement anyway? Or the places these Africans go to? Or their status in society? Or the sovereignty over their decisions? How do we understand what it means to be an African in today's globalized world? Especially considering not only our shared histories of sometimes racial exploitation, slave trade, colonial resource extractions, oppressive regimes, but also in a world where issues have become global, pandemics, global warming, governance of artificial intelligence, and so on. How are we to address these evolving issues of power distribution, of human rights distribution, of human worth and dignity distribution within our academic communities? These are important questions that invite us to rethink the role that our African Studies Associations can play, how they help and contribute to generate knowledge, how they contribute in crafting meaning, and what goals we can set for ourselves in a changing world. Indeed, our world is changing rapidly, and because of that, it is crucial to understand what it means to be African globally, wherever we may find ourselves. It is true that today's stories shape policy, and the diaspora can be most valuable assets by showcasing its spirit beyond physical presence, Africa's spirit beyond physical presence. Seeing things from this new perspective, we recognize that shared history, cultural roots, displacement, separation help us understand Africa beyond its geographic location, its colonial history, and even beyond the debate that followed after independence. So we should consider the best way to approach African studies, whether in Australia or in Europe, in the US or in Latin America, in Asia or in Africa itself. As V.Y. Mudimbe noted, the idea of Africa has been shaped by colonial agents, travelers, missionaries who shaped the colonial library. And we question whether this idea of Africa should stay fixed or should evolve. I believe Africa is more than a land. It is a space of histories, it is a place of hope, it is a place where our identities are negotiating themselves between the mainland and the diaspora. And I believe actually the diaspora broadens the very understanding of this identity across space and time. I remember some years ago I challenged the ideas of Glenn Fireboy, an American scholar, whose book entitled The New Geography of Income Inequality suggests that welfare depends now more on knowledge and connections and networks globally than on where one lives or one was born. It is true, of course, but I saw this as a double-edged sword. It could either deepen the community divides, threaten the kind of sovereignty that Africans need to build, and tempt talented Africans to leave their own nations and go find a better living elsewhere. At the same time, as a social scientist, I acknowledge that social mobility is something very important and no one is constrained because as an agent and subject of our human histories, human beings have to move, to choose, and to establish themselves wherever they feel fit. But as social systems and global order shift, we might imagine a future where loyalty isn't fixed, a future where maybe a Congolese engineer would choose to live in Tokyo, work for a Japanese company, while collaborating in real time with the Ministry of Environment in his own country. Or a Zimbabwean epidemiologist would establish himself in Geneva or San Francisco, while assisting an emergency team in Liberia, in Kampala, or some other place. So geography indeed should not constrain our capacity to contribute to the welfare of the African continent. Now the third point. I mentioned the idea of the diaspora, and I wanted to discuss two aspects of how we can live our identities as Africans in the global world based on the experience of the COVID-19, but also based on the general movement of the Black Lives Matters. During the COVID-19 lockdown, I was flipping through the East African magazine when I ran into General Ulimwengu's op-ed, in which he expressed his concern that Africans seemed passive regarding the issue related to the Black lives. While crowds congregated in Rome, in London, in Hamburg, carrying signs of Black Lives Matters, on the African continent, no one seemed to relate to this moment. This global movement raised questions about awareness that injustice anywhere, threatens justice everywhere, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr. Despite the viral footage showing George Floyd's tragic death, as Ulimwengu claims, we did not see. Africans did not see what was going on. They ignored the problem of racism. Ignoring such problems, especially involving Africans, should prompt concern and reflection. But I believe this attitude may stem from the trauma of what V.Y. Mudimbe describes as epistemological violence, or say the legitimation of the order of things using the dominant library. This has given the power to map and categorize others, as well as to control the entire system of representation. A Cameroonian economist and philosopher, Celestin Monga, suggests that the absence of solidarity among Black people on the African continent or in the diaspora, and their quiet response to ongoing historical injustices point to the lack of a shared unifying moral principle beyond the skin color. He wonders if there are meaningful bonds that go beyond pigmentation or skin pigmentation, connecting prominent figures like, say, Barack Obama or Oprah Winfrey with everyday people such as the Senegalese immigrant selling trinkets on the street of New York or Dakar. Given that the distribution of human worth, dignity, and rights across borders is a matter of politics, those who left and those who stayed may find themselves on different sides of the line. Of course, I want to argue that we all, whether on the continent or abroad, are the African diaspora. So the issue involves politics, it involves economics, it involves perceptions, it involves how people come to represent threat and opportunity. During the COVID-19, African Worldwide showed the world how the global north views us and how they continue to treat Africans as the problem. They highlighted what lenses have always been used to describe Africa: poverty, migration, maybe remittances, maybe constituting the voting bloc in host countries, maybe creating cheap labor for these countries. But all of this racial profiling perpetuate the violence of epistemologies made in the North. Indeed, when racial profiling and violence happen on the street of Paris by French police, let's say, or in New Delhi by Indian students, these acts stem from deeply rooted belief systems that justify such harmful behavior or excuse them. In fact, I find it interesting how Africans often seem indifferent to systemic violence inflicted upon them, and sadly, similar scenes or forms of policing, violence, brutalities occur on a daily basis within the African continent, targeting fellow Africans, not based on race this time, which reinforces the idea that many systems and institutions were designed to serve the interests of a privileged few. Issues of slave trades, slavery, domination, segregation, resource exploitation go beyond mere racial debates. They reveal broader systemic moral flaws that Aimé Césaire aptly described as the hypocrisy of a decadent modern civilization. My final point: what are the key takeaways? The first key takeaway is that the African diaspora can provoke intrusion, disruptions, and change the perceptions that the world has always held vis-a-vis Africa. The idea of diaspora is evolving, and so is how we view the African identity itself. This wonderful African community dispersed across the globe not only shares Africa's rich culture or the cultural treasures, they also contribute in spreading the African values through films, through fashion, through theater, music, dance, literature. They help boost the influence of African ideas and knowledge abroad. And while African scholars remain dedicated to their work of producing new insights, analyzing situations with care and rigor, the inspiring stories of these African scholars in the diaspora are very telling. I can think mostly, just for the sake of illustration, of someone like Chinua Achebe or even Adichie Chimamanda, who have beautifully challenged West-centric ways of producing knowledge or of crafting policies relating to Africa. Just a word about Chinua Achebe, whom I truly admire. His insight, his wit, his perspective. As he noted, his entire journey as a writer, his career, was shaped in reaction to the imaginary of how the European scholars, were portraying Africa. His critique, for instance, of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness highlights how Western colonial literature often relied on a skewed image of Africa, dehumanizing its people. Africa was frequently used as a symbolic foil, a backdrop, to showcase the West's view of itself as civilized and Africa as savage. Often, Africa is portrayed as faceless, voiceless, peopleless, seen as needing civilization and colonization, and labeled as the other world, the dark continent, the primitive. In response, Achebe wrote Things Fall Apart, which sparked his career as a writer, challenging the distortions in Joseph Conrad's travelogue, which featured distant stories and mythologies tailored to Western market demands. So the diaspora, and this is the second key takeaway, can help also redesign epistemic communities. There is a noticeable narrowness in Western epistemic cycles. There is a true parochialism in Western ways of disseminating, circulating knowledge. The African diaspora offers a wonderful opportunity to help break down the bias in the epistemic cycles of the West by welcoming and involving African scholars, African knowledges in these conversations. Recently, for instance, I was asked to speak about an upcoming publication by a French researcher focusing on decolonizing African studies. The author explored decolonial thoughts as a critique of the imperialist roots behind the creation of the colonial knowledge. However, he highlights the vital role of positionality of the writers, the scholars, in shaping knowledge, and he emphasizes as well the developing of epistemologies from the global south. So geography plays an important role either in shaping the sensitivities of the scholar or in determining the scholarship itself and the kind of knowledge that is produced. While one part, let's say the positionality, the location of the scholar, questions who is speaking and who has the power to speak, the other parts, let's say the production of new epistemologies, aims to distinguish Western epistemic dominance from the actual scientific validity of Western science or social sciences. At least this is the argument of the author. Toward the end, He states that criticizing African social sciences in the West as colonial studies does not undermine the scientific integrity of the knowledge produced within institutions in the global north. In essence, just because social sciences are rooted in the West does not automatically invalidate them or make them colonial. But the moment you bring in the conversation voices from the global south, you begin to understand that this position is in defense of the social sciences, which are being underfunded and which are losing their status of prestige in these major global north institutions. So, enlarging the epistemic community can help redefine the problem and envisage new solutions. My third and last key takeaway is restorative justice. There is an increasing discourse concerning the restoration, restitution, and reparation of injustices inflicted upon the African continent in the past. These initiatives encompass both tangible and symbolic dimensions. For example, regarding Africa's symbolic position or positioning on the global map, the deputy chairperson of the African Union recently, Selma Malika Haddadi, highlighted the importance of reflecting on the Mercator project, which for generations has sadly depicted Africa as diminutive and peripheral, thereby shaping perceptions within political spheres, educational books, textbooks, and international treaties. It might seem to be just a map, but in reality it is not, he argued. Africa constitutes the second largest continent, home to over 1 billion inhabitants and comprising 55 nations, and serves as a fundamental locus of human history that influences future global developments. Minimizing a continent's prominence on cartographic representations diminishes its perceived significance. Just to show how a true restitution of knowledge and meaning and symbols can help change the way we craft politics and policies related to this place. So currently the objective extends beyond merely correcting map projections. It involves challenging stereotypes that confine Africa's agency and misrepresent its true position within the global landscape. To conclude, I want to conclude this short reflection by sharing a recent inspiring encounter I made at the COP30 meeting in Belém in Brazil, where I met a true Moana woman. That's how she called herself. She came from Fiji. As we chatted about how climate change impacts different regions of the world, our different geographies, landscapes, it became clear that no matter where we are, the effects are similar. The impact and consequences are similar. Islands face the threat of disappearing with the global warming, while our lands on the African continent are being taken over by corporations seeking rare minerals. It's time to rethink how we view borders, moving away from the colonial narratives. Africa isn't just defined by its land, it is defined by its people, their aspirations, their capacity to move, to innovate, to think beyond and outside the box. Its diaspora isn't just an afterthought, but a vital part of Africa's global presence. Let's come together to foster connections and work hand in hand across Africa, across the African studies communities, on the continent, and worldwide. Thank you.